historian Robert Brenner has done a lot of work on it, is the falling rate of profit. There were other factors. It led to major changes in the economy. A reversal of the several hundred years of progress towards industrialization and development, and turned to a process of deindustrialization and de-development. Of course, manufacturing production continued, but overseas. Very profitable, but no good for the workforce. And along with that came a significant shift of the economy from productive enterprise, producing things people need or can use, to financial manipulation. Financialization of the economy really took off at that time. Before the 70s, banks were banks. They did what banks are supposed to do in a state capitalist economy: take unused funds, like, say, your bank account, and transfer it to some potentially useful purpose, like buying a home, or sending a kid to college, or whatever it might be. That changed radically, and incidentally, there were no financial crises. It was a period of enormous growth, the highest growth in American history, maybe in economic history, sustained growth through the 50s and the 60s, and it was egalitarian. So the lowest quintile did about as well as the highest quintile. A lot of people moved into reasonable lifestyles, what's called here middle class, working class it's called in other countries. But that was real, and the 60s accelerated it. The activism in the 60s, after a pretty dismal decade, really civilized the country in lots of ways that are permanent. They're not changing. They're staying on. 70s came along, sudden sharp change, deindustrialization, offshoring of production, shifting to financial institutions, which grew enormously. Also, I should say that in the 50s and the 60s, there was also the development of what several decades later became the high-tech economy. Computers, internet, IT revolution, mostly developed in the 50s and the 60s, substantially in the state sector. It took a couple of decades before it took off, but it was developed there. The 1970s, the developments that took place set off a kind of a vicious cycle. It led to concentration of wealth, increasingly in the hands of the financial sector, which doesn't benefit the economy, probably harms it and the society. But it did lead to tremendous concentration of wealth, substantially there. Concentration of wealth yields concentration of political power, which in turn gives rise to legislation that accelerates the cycle. Fiscal policies, tax changes, rules of corporate governance, deregulation, essentially bipartisan. Alongside of this began the very sharp rise in costs of elections, which drives the political parties even deeper than before into the pockets of the corporate sector. A couple of years later started a different process, which has been described particularly by Tom Ferguson, who's going to be here Monday. He probably will talk about it, so I won't much. But the parties dissolved, essentially. It used to be that if a person in Congress hoped for a position of, say, a committee chair or something, some position of responsibility, you got it mainly through seniority and service. Within a couple of years, you started having to put money into the party coffers in order to get ahead. That just drove the whole system even deeper into the pockets of the corporate sector, increasingly the financial sector. Tremendous concentration of wealth, mainly in literally the top 1/10 of 1% of the population. Meanwhile, for the general population, it began and opened a period of pretty much stagnation or even decline for the majority. people got by, but by pretty artificial means. Borrowings, a lot of debt, longer working hours, but pretty soon much higher than in other industrial countries, even past Japan, long past Europe. Can't hear me? Sorry. Yeah. Still? How about that? So there was a period of stagnation and decline for the majority that continued alongside a very sharp concentration of wealth. The political system began to dissolve. There's always been a gap between public policy and the public will, but it just grew kind of astronomically. You can see it right now. In fact, the can't hear me? I don't know what to do about it. These things are in my mouth. And they don't taste good. I'll just keep going. You can make it up.
It's on the live stream.
What?
It's recorded on the
okay.
live stream.
Just take a look at what's...
Get it on YouTube.
Get it on YouTube. Okay. Just take a look at what's happening right now. The big topic in Washington everyone concentrates on is the deficit. For the public, correctly, the deficit is not regarded as much of an issue, and it isn't really much of an issue. The issue is joblessness, not a deficit. There's a deficit commission, but there's no joblessness commission. As far as the deficit is concerned, you want to pay attention to it. The public has opinions. Take a look at the polls. Overwhelmingly support higher taxes on the wealthy, which have declined sharply during this stagnation period of decline. Higher taxes on the wealthy and preserve the limited social benefits. The outcome of the deficit commission is probably going to be the opposite. Either they'll reach an agreement, which will be the opposite of what the public wants, or else it goes into a kind of a automatic procedure, which is going to have those effects. Actually, that's something that has to be done very quickly. Deficit Commission is going to come up with its decision in a couple of weeks. The Occupy movements could provide a mass base for trying to avert what amounts to a dagger pointed at the heart of the country. It could have very negative effects. It's an immediate task. Well, without going on in the details, what's being played out for the last 30 years is actually a kind of a nightmare that was anticipated by the classical economists. If you take, say, Adam Smith, bother to read Wealth of Nations, he considered the possibility that merchants and manufacturers in England might decide to do their business abroad, invest abroad, and import from abroad. He said they would profit, but England would be harmed. However, he went on to say that they would prefer to, the merchants, manufacturers would prefer to operate in their own country, what's sometimes called a home bias. So as if by an invisible hand, England would be saved the ravages of what's now called neoliberal globalization. That's a pretty hard passage to miss. In his classic Wealth of Nations, that's the only occurrence of the phrase invisible hand. Maybe England would be saved from neoliberal globalization by an invisible hand. The other great classical economist, David Ricardo, recognized the same thing and hoped that it wouldn't happen, kind of sentimental hope. And it didn't for a long time, but now it's happening. The last 30 years, that's exactly what's been underway. For the general population, you know, the 99% in the imagery of the Occupy movements, it's been pretty harsh, and it could get worse. This could be a period of irreversible decline. For the 1%, even more, 1/10 of 1%, it's just fine. They're at the top of the richer than ever, more powerful than ever, controlling the political system, disregarding the public, and If it can continue, sure, why not? Just what Smith and Ricardo warned about. So, for example, take, say, Citigroup, for decades, one of the most corrupt of the major kind of investment banking corporations, repeatedly bailed out by the taxpayer over and over again, starting in the early Reagan years. Now, once again, I won't run through the corruption. You probably know about it, but it's pretty astonishing. A couple of years ago, they came out with a brochure for investors. They urged investors to put their money in what they call the plutonomy index. They said the world is dividing into a plutonomy, the rich, those who buy luxury goods and so on, and that's where the action is. They said their plutonomy index is way outperforming the stock market, so put your money into it. And as for the rest, we set them adrift. We don't really care about them. We don't need them. They have to be around to provide a powerful state which will protect us and bail us out when we get into trouble, but other than that, they essentially have no function. They're sometimes called these days the precariat, people who live a precarious existence at the periphery of society. It's not the periphery anymore. It's becoming a very substantial part of the society in the United States and indeed elsewhere. And this is considered a good thing. So, for example, Alan Greenspan, at the time when little competition, when Alan Greenspan was still, St. Alan, hailed by the economics profession as one of the greatest economists of all time. This was before the crash for which he was substantially responsible. He was testifying to Congress in the Clinton years, explaining the wonders of the great economy that he was supervising. And he said a lot of the success of this economy, he said, is based substantially on what he called growing worker insecurity.
Can you announce that they need to stay off of the grassed, roped-in areas?
Please stay... Yeah, let's do it this way. Please stay off of the roped-in grass area over there. That's a very nicely done organic area, and we're trying to keep it clean.
You heard him, I guess. Greenspan testified that the very successful economy he was supervising, which has the properties I described, was based substantially on growing worker insecurity. If working people are insecure, if they're part of what we now call the precariat, living precarious existences, they're not going to make demands, they're not going to try to get wages, they won't get benefits, we can kick them out if we don't like them, and that's good for the health of the economy. That's what's called a healthy economy, technically. And he was very highly praised for this, greatly admired. Well, now the world is indeed splitting into a plutonomy and a precariat. Again, in the imagery of the Occupy movements, the 1% and the 99%, not literal numbers, but the right picture. And the plutonomy is where the action is. Well, it could continue like this. And if it does continue, this historic reversal that began in the 1970s could become irreversible. That's where we're heading. And the Occupy movements are, the first real major reaction, popular reaction, which could avert this. But as I said, it's going to be necessary to face the fact that it's a long, hard struggle. You don't win victories tomorrow. Have to go on. You have to form structures that will be sustained. They'll go on through hard times and can win major victories. Now, there are a lot of things that can be done. I mentioned before the...
Give me one of those mics so people can hear you better.
Sorry. Just keep
that one up to your mouth, sweetie.
Okay, I'll keep this. I mentioned before that in the 1930s, one of the most effective actions was sit-down strikes. and the reason is very simple. That's just a step before takeover of the industry. Well, through the 70s, as the decline was setting in, there were some very important events that took place. One was in the late 70s, 1977. U.S. Steel decided to close one of its major facilities, Youngstown, Ohio, and instead of just walking away, the workforce and the community decided to get together and buy it from U.S. Steel and hand it over to the workforce to run and turn it into a worker-owned, worker management facility. They didn't win, but with enough popular support, they could have won. And it was a partial victory. It's a topic that Edgar Alperovitz particularly has discussed in detail. It was a partial victory because even though they lost, it set off other efforts. And now throughout Ohio, and in fact in other places, there's a scattering, hundreds, maybe thousands of sometimes not so small worker-owned, or at least partially worker-owned industries, which could become worker-managed. And that's the basis for a real revolution. That's how it takes place. It's happening here, too. Just in one of the suburbs of Boston about a year ago, something similar happened. A multinational decided to close down a profitable, functioning manufacturing facility. It was doing some high-tech manufacturing, not profitable enough for them. The workforce and the union offered to buy it and take it over and run it themselves. And the multinational decided to close it down instead, probably for reasons of class consciousness. I don't think they want things like this to happen. If there had been enough popular support, if there'd been something like this movement and it could have gotten involved, they might have succeeded. And there are other things going on like that. In fact, some of them are major. So not long ago, Obama took over the auto industry. It was basically owned by the public. And there were a number of things that could have been done. One was what was done. Reconstitute it so that it can be handed back to the ownership or very similar ownership and continue on its traditional path. The other possibility was to hand it over to the workforce, which owned it anyway, turn it into worker-owned, worker-managed, major industrial system that's a big part of the economy, and have it produce things that people need. And there's a lot that we need. We all know, or should know, that the U.S. is extremely backward globally in high-tech and high-speed transportation. It's very serious. It not only affects people's lives, it affects the economy. It's a very serious business. Just had a personal story. I happened to be giving talks in France a couple months ago and ended up in southern France. I had to take a train from Avignon, southern France, but to the de Gaulle airport in Paris. And it took 2 hours. It's the same distance as Washington to Boston. I don't know if you've taken that train, but it's about what it was, 60 years ago when my wife and I first took it. And it's a scandal, But it could be done. They had the capacity to do it, the skilled workforce. We've taken a little support, popular support, and that could have made a major change in the economy. Just to make it more surreal, while this option was being avoided, the Obama administration was sending its transportation secretary to Spain to get contracts for developing high-speed rail for the United States, which could have been done right in the Rust Belt, which is being closed down. There's no economic reasons why this can't happen. These are class reasons and reflect the lack of popular political mobilization. Well, things like this continue. We have... Oh, I see. You can see why I'm not a public speaker. Okay. Well, I'll just... like that? A little late, but... well, I think I've probably talked enough anyway, so let me just say that... and I'd like to make more sense to turn this over to public discussion. But I kept to domestic issues, and these are by no means the only ones. You all know that. There's very dangerous developments in the international arena, including two of them, which are kind of a shadow that hangs over almost everything we discuss. There are, for the first time in human history, real threats to decent survival of the species. There are two. One has been hanging around since 1945. It's kind of a miracle we've escaped it. That's the threat of nuclear war, nuclear weapons. And though it isn't being much discussed, that threat is in fact being escalated by policies of this administration and its allies. And that something has to be done about that, or we're in real trouble. The other, of course, is environmental catastrophe. The world is, practically every country in the world is taking at least halting steps towards trying to do something about it. The U.S. is also taking steps, namely to accelerate the threat. The U.S. is the only country, major country, that's not only not doing something constructive, but is not climbing on the train, it's pulling it backwards. Congress right now is dismantling legislation instituted by the Nixon administration, really the last liberal president in the United States, literally. And it shows you what's been going on. They're dismantling the limited measures of the Nixon administration to try to do something about what's a growing, emerging catastrophe. And this is connected with a huge propaganda system, perfectly openly declared by the business world, to try to convince people that it's all just a liberal hoax. Why pay attention to these scientists? And we're really regressing back to the medieval period. It's not a joke. Now, if that's happening in the most powerful, richest country in history, this catastrophe isn't going to be averted. And everything else we're talking about won't matter in a generation or two. Well, all that's going on right now. Something has to be done about it very soon, in a dedicated, sustained way. It's not going to be easy to proceed. There are going to be barriers, difficulties, hardships, failures. It's inevitable. But unless the process that's taking place here, elsewhere in the country and around the world, unless that continues to grow and becomes a kind of a major force in the social and political world, the chances for a decent future are not very high.
So we're open to just a few questions right now. It's a little hard to see. I guess why don't we take... Oh, hold on.
This guy in the back there, he was first.
I just called on this person. I think if I'm doing it, I'll do it, and I'll call you next.
As far as fixing the...
As far as fixing
the political dysfunction in this country, one idea I've heard mentioned in various places, I've heard it mentioned here, is having a constitutional convention or a constitutional amendment to abolish corporate personhood or to get corporate money out of that context.
So, hold on just a sec. He's talking about corporate personhood and getting the money out of that stream in politics.
Yeah, these are very good things to do, but you can't do this or anything else unless there's a large, active, popular base. If the Occupy movement was, the leading force in the country, you could push this forward. But remember, most people don't know that this is happening. They may know about it, but not know what it is. And among those who do know, polls show that there's a lot of support, but that assigns a task. It's necessary to get out into the country and get people to understand what this is about and what they can do about it, and what the consequences are of not doing about it, not doing anything about it. And corporate personhood is an important case in point, but pay attention to what it is. We should think about it. Now, if you read we're supposed to worship the Constitution these days. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says that no person shall be deprived of rights without due process, of law. Well, the Founding Fathers didn't mean by person, they didn't mean person. So, for example, there were a lot of creatures of flesh and blood who weren't persons. The indigenous population, for example, they didn't have any rights. There was a category of creatures called 3/5 human in the Constitution, slave population. They weren't persons. And in fact, women were barely persons, so they didn't have rights. Well, a lot of this was somewhat rectified over the years. During the Civil War, the 14th Amendment raised the 3/5 humans to full humans, at least in principle. That was only in principle. I won't go through what happened next, but at least in principle. Now, if you come to over the following years, the concept of person was changed by the courts in two ways. One way was to broaden it to include corporations, legal fictions established and sustained by the state. In fact, these persons later became the management of corporations, according to the court decisions. So the management of corporations, they became persons. Of course, that's not what the 14th Amendment says. It was also narrowed to undocumented immigrants. They had to be excluded from the category of persons. And that's happening right now. So the legislations that you're talking about, they go two ways. They broaden the category of persons to include corporate persons, which by now have rights way beyond human beings, given by the trade agreements and others. And they exclude people who flee from Central America, where the U.S. devastated their homelands, free from Mexico, because they can't compete with the U.S. Highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. Remember when NAFTA was passed in 1994, Clinton administration understood pretty well that it was going to devastate the Mexican economy, and that's the year when they started militarizing the border. Well, okay, now we're getting the consequences, and these people have to be excluded from the category of persons. So when you talk about personhood, that's right, but there's more than one aspect to it, and it ought to be pushed forward, and all ought to be understood and acted upon, but that requires a mass base. It requires that the population understands this and is committed to it. So it's easy to think of a lot of things that should be done, but they all have a prerequisite, namely a mass popular base is there which is committed to implementing them.
And we have a question about the ruling class in America. How likely is it that they will have an open fascist system here?
I think it's very unlikely, frankly. They don't have the force. About a century ago, in the freest countries in the world, Britain and the United States, at that time, the dominant classes came to understand that they can't control the population by force any longer. Too much freedom had been won by struggles like these. So they realized it. I mean, it's self-conscious, it's discussed in their literature, and they recognized they're going to have to shift tactics to control of attitudes and beliefs instead of just the cudgel. You don't throw away the cudgel, but it's not can't do what it used to do. You have to control attitudes and beliefs, and in fact, that's when the public relations industry began in the United States and England, the free countries, where you had to have a major industry to control beliefs and attitudes, to induce consumerism, induce passivity, apathy, distraction, all the things you know very well. And that's the way it's been going on. But it's a barrier, but it's a lot easier to overcome than torture and the Gestapo. And I don't think they are anymore in the circumstances exist any longer for instituting anything like what we called fascism.
Excellent. And John from the library would like to ask his question, and then I have a few notes here. If you stand up, I will pass a note card to you, and if you could write your question. I've got one question over here and one question over there headed towards me, but if you stand up, we'll try to fit in a few others.
Sir, I have a two-part question that I've been waiting to ask you my whole life. You mentioned earlier that sit-down protests were just precursors to a takeover of industry. I would like to ask you if today you would advocate a general strike as an effective tactic moving forward. And second, would you ever, if asked, allow for your voice to relay the democratically chosen will of our nation?
I'm not sure I understand. My voice wouldn't help. I can't even reach you. But and besides, you don't want leaders. You want to do it yourself. Not that I could be one.
We will need representation in the international table.
We need representation, but you should pick it yourselves, and they should be recallable representatives, so you're not going to fall into some system of control and hierarchy. But this question of the general strike is like the others. You can think of it as a possible idea at a time when the population is ready for it. We can't sit here and declare a general strike, obviously. There has to be approval, agreement, willingness to take the risks, to participate on the part of the large mass of the population. And that takes organization, education, activism. Education doesn't mean just telling people what to believe. It means learning ourselves. There's a famous line of Karl Marx, which I'm sure you all know, that the task is not just to understand the world, but to change it. And there's a variant of that which also should be kept in mind. If you want to change the world in a constructive direction, you better try to understand it first. And understanding it doesn't mean listening to a talk, reading a book, although that's helpful sometimes. It means learning, and you learn through participation. You learn from others. You learn from the people you're trying to organize. And you have to gain the experience and understanding which will make it possible to maybe to implement ideas like that as a tactic. But there's a long way to go. That doesn't happen by a flick of a wrist. That happens by hard, long-term, dedicated work. And I think in many ways maybe the most exciting aspect of the Occupy movement is just the construction of these associations, bonds, linkages, and others that are taking place all over, whether it's a cooperative kitchen or something else. And out of that, if they can be sustained, can come and expanded to the large part of the population that doesn't even know what's going on. If that can happen, then you can raise questions about tactics like this, which could very well at some point be appropriate.